Hello, I'm Walter Dalton, President of Isothermal Community College, and today we are honored and privileged to have New York Times best-selling author John Cribb with us on our beautiful campus. Mr. Cribb just released his newest novel, Old Abe. It's a work of historical fiction depicting the last 5 years of the life of Abraham Lincoln. John, welcome to Isothermal Community College. We're happy to have you here today.
Well, thanks for having me on your beautiful, beautiful campus. I love it.
Well, thank you. You've done a great job already with some of our students in our book club. And I do want to get to the book. It's a wonderful book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. But before we get to the book, I think some of the people watching would like to know a little bit about John Cribb. Where did you grow up? Where were you educated? What inspired you to become a writer? What makes you tick? So could you give us a little bit of information about yourself?
Sure, yeah. I grew up right down the road in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and lived there until it's time to go off to college, and then I went to college in Nashville, Tennessee at Vanderbilt. And then after that, I went up to Washington to work for the Reagan administration. That shows you how old I am. And I thought I'd be there for 1 year, and I ended up almost 20 years in Washington. And of course, I wasn't working for President Reagan that whole time. And then my wife and I moved back to Spartanburg in 2001 to raise our family, our 2 daughters. And, you know, I think I knew early on I wanted to be a writer. I always enjoyed, loved reading, and did real well in writing and in English classes. And so, and I fell in love with Lincoln at a pretty early age. So I guess this was going to happen sooner or later, this novel.
Well, that leads me to my next question, and getting to the novel a little bit. I've been to Ford's Theater. I've been to that museum across the way with that huge stack of books, and over 15,000 books have been written about Abraham Lincoln. So you kind of think maybe the field is saturated out there, but maybe it's an insatiable appetite for Lincoln. But why, with all the writings that are already out there about Lincoln, what chose you to pick this, the last 5 years, and particularly to make it an historical fiction novel?
Yeah, it's a great question, because there are, I mean, it was kind of a daunting idea to write a book about Lincoln, because there are so many. And I think that 15,000 number, I think somebody counted about 10 years ago, got up to 15,000. I think he stopped. I think there are more than that, and there's certainly been more in the last 10 years. Surprisingly, well, maybe not surprisingly, the overwhelming majority of those are nonfiction. There are not that many Lincoln novels out there, believe it or not. So I decided to do historical fiction partly for that reason, but also because I really wanted to bring him alive and make him a walking, talking, breathing fellow. And of course, you know, we know fiction can do that in ways that nonfiction can't. Yeah.
Well, I think you did that. I think that is what is unique about your book, and that's why I think everybody out there should read this book. It is a fascinating book and gives a perspective that no one else has given that I have seen. And as you read the book, obviously it was one of the most difficult times in our country's history, if not the most difficult time in our country's history. The country was splitting apart, but that wasn't all that was going on within his family. It was a time that brother was against brother in the Civil War, and his wife had 3 brothers that fought for the South. That had to be difficult. It led to some mental health issues with his wife, which led to that, combined with the Civil War and other things, some depression that he had. Talk a little bit about that, of how he was dealing with both the Civil War, which was unprecedented, and family issues that created great difficulty.
Yeah, that's correct. And you know, really there are 3 main characters in this novel. The first, of course, is Lincoln. And you know, the reader is just at his side. It begins in the spring of 1860, right before he's nominated, and you're at his side in every chapter, every scene as he goes through the presidency and the Civil War. The other main character is Mary, his wife. And the third really is the war. You know, there's no villain in this book in the sense of, you know, the Wicked Witch of the West or something like that. But there's this almost this force that he runs up again, that he's swept up in even before he becomes president, as soon as he's elected. And he's battling it the whole way through his presidency. And at the same time, as you say, he's trying to really hold on to his wife. And it's not that it was a deeply committed relationship. They loved each other very much. It's never that their marriage was in danger, but it came under severe strain. And they both came under severe strain during this presidency because they were just surrounded by death and destruction. They lost almost immediately. They began to lose friends. The first Union officer killed in the war was a young fellow named Elmer Ellsworth that was a friend of theirs from Springfield. Not long after that, a good friend, Ned Baker, who they had named one of their sons after, was killed in the fighting at Ball's Bluff in Virginia. It just went on and on. And Mary, the longer it went, especially after they lost their son Willie in the White House. He died of typhoid fever. I think that was really kind of a straw that broke the camel's back. And she had a hard time holding it together. So at the same time that he's prosecuting this war, he's trying to prop her up and help her, hold on. He was, it seems odd to say this, but in a way was lucky in that he did have this job to do. He had to be the president. He had to focus on that, even though their son dies and all this horrible thing happens. She really didn't have that, something like that. And I think that, that was a problem for her, I think.
Well, in reading the book and some of the history I've read about Lincoln, one thing I think is interesting and perhaps an asset, but perhaps one of his greatest challenges, people tended to underestimate Abraham Lincoln, very much so, and particularly in the presidential race. He was from Illinois, he was from the West, he wasn't Eastern Seaboard, he wasn't New York, he wasn't Boston. And how did he overcome that, and was it an advantage to be underestimated like that?
Yeah, sometimes I think it was. He overcame it by pure perseverance, I think. And of course, he was very smart. He was a very smart guy, and he had a lot of self-confidence in a lot of ways. There was some self-doubt too, because he was conscious of the fact that he did not have a lot of education. Lincoln used to say his father sent him to school by littles. He said a little here and a little there in between plantings and plowings out on the frontier. And those littles added up to less than 1 year of formal education his entire life. And that took place in little log cabin schoolhouses out on the Kentucky and Indiana frontiers. So he always was conscious of that he did not have the formal education that a lot of the people that he was dealing with did. And he had to make up for that. But he made up with it for sure willpower of reading and studying and educating himself, and then perseverance of just, when he ran up against somebody who thought, oh, he's a rube, he's from the sticks, he can't do it. Lincoln would just, he'd keep going.
Right.
Keep going, yeah.
Well, and I think his stepmother was a large force in him wanting to get an education in reading, to be self-educated, but he would walk miles just to get a book.
He would, yeah. His dad, Tom Lincoln, did not put as much stock in education as I think Lincoln would have liked him to. So there were times when Lincoln was growing up when he wanted to be reading, and his father would say, get out there and get behind that plow. But his stepmother, I think, always tried to find a way for him when he could to get to school and get books in his hands and that kind of thing. She was a very important figure in his life. Sally Lincoln, Sarah Bush Johnson Lincoln, Sally Lincoln, yeah.
Well, when we look at modern politics today, we keep hearing that the parties are so polarized, nobody can come together and get anything done. He was president during the time that you talk about polarization. The South was seceding from the United States. The total nation was split.
Yeah.
Yet he was known as a unifier and someone that could bring people together, to the extent that the opponents that he faced in the Republican primary all became part of his cabinet.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about his ability to bring people together, and how would he address that today?
Yeah. Well, he did have that ability, and he was even known for it when he was an attorney in Springfield. He had the reputation for, as many lawyers do, he would rather see people settle than actually go to the courthouse door, and was known for telling a client, look, if you'll learn to get along with this guy over here, I'll, maybe not even charge you for my services. But when he got to Washington, as you say, he, from the beginning, was determined, I think, to be a unifier. And he did. He took the men who ran against him for the Republican nomination, and he put them into that famous team of rivals cabinet, where they're in his cabinet, his former opponents. And he wanted to do that partly because he knew they had more experience, more governing experience than he did, and he wanted to learn from them. He was a great listener. He was a great learner. But he, throughout the war, he played the role of unifier as best he could. He, even from the very beginning, his first inaugural address, he says to the Southerners, he says, we are friends. We must not be enemies. We must be friends. He says that passions may have strained the bonds of our affection, but they must not break them. And throughout the war, he is consistently refusing to admit that these states have actually gone out of the Union. He keeps saying, you know, he refers to them as being out of their practical, proper relationship with the Union. He always is saying, we're all Americans. We're all in this together. He does it on a personal level, and he does it on a politically on a national level. And I think that's probably one, if he were still around today, that'd probably still be one message he would be bringing to us, is that, you know, we are always going to have our differences, and there are times in our nation's history when those passions are more inflamed, and those differences seem starker. But I think if Lincoln were here, he would be still being the great unifier and saying, look, we're all Americans. We're in this together.
Well, and my take on it, too, is when he had the team of rivals and the people who had run against him in the Republican primary, he respected their knowledge, as you said. He wanted the best minds there in his cabinet. I think some of it was that he wanted to keep your friends close and your enemies closer. These are people who had run against him. And some of those, as you reference in your book, were condescending toward him. He was the Rube from Illinois. They were the ones that should have had the nomination, and in their minds they were not accepting of Lincoln. But he won all of them but one over, I think, at the end of the day. How did he win them over?
Well, I think they realized that he really was the smartest guy in the room, probably, and had great judgment and knew what he was doing. His chief rival for the nomination, William Henry Seward of New York, who really thought, you know, he should have won, Lincoln chose him to be his Secretary of State, which wasn't as the job as we know it today. It was almost more like his right-hand man in running the government, was kind of like the premier in European countries. Seward came into that job at the beginning of the Lincoln administration thinking that he was going to be the power behind the throne, that he was going to be pulling the strings and really calling the shots. Lincoln pretty quickly disabused him of that notion, but did it in a good way, and they became friends. And Seward was somebody who shared a love of a good story, like Lincoln did. And often, those were the two that would stay behind after a cabinet meeting to maybe swap stories and, you know, be a joke or two. Seward wrote to his wife not long after he was in that job. He said, the president is the best of us. So he came around. Another cabinet member, he wasn't in that original team of rivals, but Stanton, his Secretary of War, who was a Democrat, and the original, Lincoln's first Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, just didn't work out. And Stanton was an attorney, and Lincoln had run into him before in their practices in Cincinnati, and it was a case involving the famous McCormick Reaper. And Stanton was very rude to Lincoln, cut him out of the case, wouldn't let him talk in the courtroom, basically told him to go home. And, you know, most people would not have been able to get over that. But Lincoln knew that he was the best man for the job, and so he called Stanton in and said, I want you to be my Secretary of War. And Stanton ended up being a very good Secretary of War, and they ended up being pretty close to each other.
I gathered that from the book, and I think Lincoln also saw that Stanton treated everybody that way. He was a pretty nasty guy when it came to interpersonal relationships.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, what I love about your book is it does put the human element into it by making it historical fiction. You take actual fact, but you get the emotion, the thrill of victory, the agony of defeat, so to speak, and what was going on in Lincoln's mind. He had so much going on. We've talked about the family issues that were there. A civil war, nothing could be worse than that, yet he had problems within not only working with his cabinet, they turned out pretty well, but working with his generals. McClellan comes across, I think, a little more narcissistic. He loved to march, he loved to parade, he loved to prance, he didn't want to fight.
Right.
And it actually reminded me a little bit of President Truman and MacArthur in that a general getting a little too big for their pants, perhaps. Yeah. And ultimately, he had to remove McClellan and get Ulysses S. Grant, who was a guy of action. And but how did he approach the military, because he had no military experience?
Right. Yeah. He realized that when he got there that he had a tiny bit of military experience. He was a volunteer in the Black Hawk War in Illinois back when he was a young man living in the village of New Salem, Illinois. But it wasn't anything to speak of. All he did was march around in the woods. So he really had no military experience. He actually checked books out of the Library of Congress when he got to the White House to try to learn more about battlefield strategy, and did a pretty good job of teaching it to himself. But yes, Lincoln had so much common sense, and he was so smart. He pretty quickly figured out who the good generals were and who the bad ones were. He was very frustrated, as you say, that he couldn't get them moving. He said, once he said famously, McClellan has the slows. He said he's all about getting ready, but then when it comes to getting going to the fight, he dragged his feet. And he finally had enough after the Battle of Antietam. Lincoln went up to Maryland and sat him down, and really had almost a father to son like talk with him. And this is one of the chapters in the book where he sat him down and he said, George, he said, you may have a character flaw, I'm paraphrasing, a character flaw that you're not aware of, but I'd like to tell you about it. And he says, you were better than anybody else at getting ready to do something. When it comes time to get ready to actually do it, you for whatever reason, there's something in you that you can't bring yourself to do it. And he finally ends up just having to relieve him of command. Grant, on the other hand, he had been watching Grant out west for months. And they called Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, the U.S. stood for unconditional surrender. I mean, Grant was just a bulldog. He just went. And Lincoln didn't want to bring him out of the West until really he had finished what he needed to do out there. But once the time came, he brought Grant east, and he said, you're the man. You put him in charge, yeah.
Well, I've talked about the humanity in the book, but Lincoln was a person that was very humane, that showed a lot of empathy and would visit the troops, both in the field and there in Washington.
Yeah, he would. He visited the troops. He would go to the hospitals, and he would go into the hospitals where the Confederate soldiers were. There's, for example, there's one, and again, all this is what you read in this book. It's told as a story, but I worked very hard to get it as accurate as I could, so it all happened. He was down at City Point, Virginia, and there was a huge hospital down there, and men in tents. And he started to walk into one of them, and there was a young officer. He said, Mr. President, you don't want to go in there, and he said, why not? And he said, well, that's where the Confederate wounded are. And Lincoln said, well, that's exactly where I want to go. And he went in and started shaking hands. And he came up to one fellow lying in a bed, and the guy didn't want to shake his hand. And he said, do you know who you're talking to, Mr. Lincoln? He said, no. And he said, you're talking to a soldier who has spent 4 years fighting as hard as I can against you every day. And Lincoln said, he said, I understand it, but I hope you get well, and I hope you get back to home soon, and I hope you will shake my hand. And the guy did. He shook his hand. Yeah.
And again, he had such empathy, and while the country had split apart, many say that the South we would have recovered much better and much faster had Lincoln remained president, because he was telling the generals to let the Confederate troops go home,
yes.
Let them take their guns with them,
yes.
Tell them to plow their fields, we're all one.
Yes.
And again, it's how do you think Reconstruction would have happened had Lincoln lived?
I like to think it would have gone better, and he was, towards the end of his life, that's where his thoughts were as the war wound down. He really was thinking hard about Reconstruction. I don't think he wanted to be remembered as a president who, could make it maybe through the war, but couldn't bring the country back together again. And you're absolutely right. Those famous orders, or the famous terms that Grant gave to Robert E. Lee at Appomattox, where the officers keep their sidearms and the soldiers keep their guns to take home and their horses for plowing. That came from Lincoln. He had sat down with Grant and Sherman right before that time and said to them, when this winds down, I want you to give them easy terms. there's a great, fascinating story that's in the book about right after Richmond falls, he decides he wants to go into Richmond. Right after it falls, and he just gets in a boat, and he goes with about a dozen soldiers, and then he walks through the streets of Richmond as it's still smoldering, something that would never happen today. As he's coming out, one of the generals asks him, "How do you want us to treat the Southerners?" And Lincoln says, "If I were you, I would let them up easy." He says, "Let them up easy." So that's really who he was.
Well, a great president, great man, and you know, he was such an orator. He was so well educated, although self-educated. Obviously, I think a good writer. I think it's curious and interesting that his greatest speech was one of the shortest he would have ever have given, and that was the Gettysburg Address. Tell us a little bit about how that came about and his thought process there.
Well, they were, of course, this was after the Battle of Gettysburg, which had taken place in July of 1863. So after the battle, the citizens, people of Gettysburg, decided to make a national cemetery, a cemetery they could bury. They had all these people that had been hastily buried all over the battlefield. They wanted to bring them and put them in one cemetery, the Union soldiers. So it was a dedication for that cemetery. Lincoln was asked to come as just, not as an afterthought, but he was not the main speaker. He was basically just asked to come to give a few remarks in dedication, is all it was. But he wanted to turn it into a message to the North to explain to them why they had to go on fighting this terrible, awful war. He begins working on it before he goes up to Gettysburg. Historians think he probably worked it on more on the train, and then he actually finishes it up and writes copies it out in the Wills house where he stays the night before in Gettysburg. Which if you ever go to Gettysburg, those who haven't been there, of course, go to the battlefield, but go to downtown Gettysburg. You go to the house where he stayed the night before and finished out writing out the address. But anyway, that's the brilliance of that speech, is that even though it is so short, Lincoln succeeds in explaining to the Northern people why they need to go on and finish this up. And it's that dedication to those founding principles that he talks about in the speech that makes it such a great speech that's resonated through the ages.
Well, you did such a wonderful job with the book, and I'm not going to spoil the ending for the people who may be watching. I want them to read this wonderful book. But we all know how the story ends with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. But the way you approach that, the way you handle that, is absolutely unique and beautiful, really.
Thank you.
And people are going to have to get the book and read it. We are right now, as we film this, in an age of COVID. And so as an author who's had 2 New York Times best-selling books, and now this new one is out and you're trying to promote a book, how do you do that in the age of COVID? It has to limit you.
It's not easy, I tell you. It's been, but of course, we're on the same boat on that. So a lot of the, the events like this that I were scheduled way back last February before COVID, really hit. And at first we thought, oh, surely by the time fall rolls around, this will be taken care of. Of course, that didn't happen. And so most of them were either canceled or postponed or turned into Zoom events. And there's a silver lining to Zoom, and that is that you can communicate with people all over the country that normally you may not be able to. So I've had Zoom events all over the place. But then I've had some where we've still gone forward and we've used precautions. We've either done outside events or we've worn masks, and like here. And so, believe me, writers are very, very grateful to places like Isothermal Community College that will have people come in and speak. We really are, because it helps a lot.
Well, we appreciate your being here. You spoke to our students in book club today, did a wonderful, wonderful job. For some of those students who are aspiring authors, what would you tell them? What advice would you give someone?
Writing is like anything else. It takes practice. It's like learning to play the piano or be a really good baseball player or anything else. It's just practice. It's just getting there and doing it over and over again. It doesn't matter how much talent you have. If you don't practice, then it's not going to get done. It also takes a lot of reading, because you're not going to be a good writer unless you read a lot too. And I think, again, as Lincoln, as I say, was a model of perseverance, and a lot of it's just a matter of perseverance. Yeah.
Well, I think the people who helped get you to where you are, and anyone has people behind them that have helped. The introduction to your book is by William Bennett, who you have collaborated with on some of the works you've done together and been very, very successful with that. Former Secretary of Education, former the drug czar over the war on drugs. And someone I want to give a shout out to is Kathy Bennett and her husband Roy, Magic Times Publications. You give her a nice acknowledgement in your book, and she has brought authors to Isothermal. And we are always very, very happy to have her bring authors, and particularly having you here today. Again, I'm going to ask all the people that may be watching to please go out and either buy the hardback book or download it on your Kindle, Old Abe. You will never, ever regret reading this book. It will give you a unique perspective pertaining to Abraham Lincoln. And it, again, gives you the humanity of what was going on both within the Lincoln household and with the Union Army and with our nation at that particular time. So, John, thank you for being with us today. It's been our honor and privilege to have you here. We invite you back to our campus at any time, and I do hope you're very, very successful, and I know you will be with this new book.
Well, thank you for having me. As I told you, I've driven past Isothermal many times. The first time I've actually been on campus. This is a beautiful part of the state, so I loved being here, so thank you very much.
It is a beautiful part of the state, and thank you for being here. And again, to all those watching, look forward to some other authors that may be coming to Isothermal, and we'll hope to do this again very soon. Thank you for watching, and John, thank you for being here.
Thank you.